we were married 17 years, and the first 10 years, everything was just perfect. And then out of the blue, about after 10 years, I noticed that he just started doing, things out of his character. And, he didn't want to socialize as much. He started to accuse people around him of taking things.
He was suspicious of you.
Yeah, he was suspicious of me.
Thinking you were in the FBI or something.
Yeah, right. He was thinking that somebody was tapping our phone at home, listening. And at the time, I didn't know what it was because I didn't even know anything about schizophrenia back then. I don't think he really accepted it. And that's another thing, acceptance is really hard in our community. And he never really got to the point where he could really face, what he was dealing with. And so he basically just started drinking. And that was how he dealt with his pain. And eventually, he ended up with cirrhosis of the liver. But that happens a lot to people because they can't accept it, and it is devastating news, He didn't know anything about schizophrenia. And, from his culture, especially, from the African culture, they're not, mental illness is just completely off the radar, And so that's another reason too, I think why he couldn't accept that, because they just don't talk about it. Well, my son was diagnosed with schizophrenia at 20. When he was in high school, he had a hard time concentrating. His behavior had changed. He was doing things out of his character. So he was diagnosed at 20. He struggled a lot. He was in and out of the mental health hospital. He did have therapy, he saw a therapist once a week after that. And he just, he got on medication, but he still didn't, completely get better. So it was a long journey, So we tried our best to, understand his illness the best we could.
My brother's was worse. And I think the similarities is that my brother also started to drink and, smoke marijuana. And that may have been a way to cope, like you said, just sort of block out what was happening mentally. I think my brother's his signs were a little worse because he would talk. Well, they both would talk to themselves, but my brother would laugh a lot by himself. And so it was odd because he seemed, he almost seemed like he was really happy all the time. But the reality is that he was really struggling mentally. And I think at the time, I didn't know. I actually learned more about schizophrenia after he passed because I started reading more about it. At the time, I didn't know enough about it.
I didn't know he was struggling to the extent that he would take his life. I didn't know that he was, I never would have thought that in a million years. I think it was voices that told him to do that. I really do, yeah.
I think so too. I mean, it was, definitely challenging growing up with a father who he had schizophrenia. I don't know if he was ever diagnosed with it, but then, with my brother actually being diagnosed at 20 years old, 20, was it?
Yeah, at 20.
You just find out how marginalized people are who have a mental health issue, especially people who have schizophrenia. In the African American community, there's a huge stigma about any mental health issue. A lot of times people just say, well, that person is crazy, and that's sort of the end of that. We tend to not seek as much therapy and things like that as people in other communities. So I think people of color oftentimes, depending on, where they live, what zip code and things like that, may not have the same access that other people have to certain resources. So whether that be, maybe they don't have health insurance, or maybe even if they do, they go in to see someone and it's really hard to find, a African-American, doctor. And they may not feel that connection with a doctor that they cannot identify with. And so then they may not come back to receive services or treatment. Many of us have Southern roots, and so we come from a certain, culture, which, is Methodist and heavily Baptist, and a lot of us have roots in the church. And I think a Black provider could sort of combine, this is, the spiritual aspect of it, and this is the medical aspect. And let's see how we can put these two things together and come up with a way that we can tackle, this issue of mental health.
So there's a place downtown, it's called Our Space. And, I go down there, I sit in support groups with them, I play cards with them, I teach them how to use the computer. And that's what I notice about all of them there that come there, is that they have accepted where they are in life. And so, they all take medication. Some of them don't have family at all. And they come there and that's their family. And so when I go down there, I'm just amazed, because sometimes we have support groups and they ask them, well, how do you feel today? And some of them actually say, I'm happy. I feel happy. Some of them work there at Our Space, yeah. And some of them have part-time jobs, and a lot of them they're real happy with their jobs. And it's really good just to see, someone that's come so far and be able to, accept it. And of course, like anything else, some of them have, tried to, commit suicide, but they have overcome that. And so it's just good to just sit down and talk to them and, and just have a conversation with them and just see, where they're going. And so my daughter and I here, we got together and we wrote a book to educate children about the disease of schizophrenia. And so, we're hoping that people will learn, from our book. And even though it's a children's book, it's good for teenagers, it's good for adults.
There's two missions. The first mission is just the representation of African Americans and people of color in general in literature, just seeing ourselves through the stories and the eyes of, other people. We were actually very intentional about the characters being characters of color. So we purposely put, Asian person in there, Latino person, and just to show different representation, that this is something that we're all connected to in some way. And then the second thing, as far as mental illness, is just telling the story that so many families go through of struggling with a mental health issue. In this case, it's schizophrenia. In other cases, it's depression, bipolar, autism. The list goes on. I wish when I was growing up, there was a book like that I could read, because I didn't know what was going on with my dad. I didn't know exactly, I needed a picture of what schizophrenia really meant. There's a scene in the book where Adam is taking his medication. Even something that simple, to see it in a children's book, it's like, oh, it kind of normalizes a little bit. Like, okay, this is something that, people do. They take medication so they can feel better. We're just hoping that we can open up a conversation that a lot of people aren't having. So yeah, my hope is that this is a first step in the right direction.